There are stories about Motown that people describe as too heavy to say out loud, not because no one remembers them, but because once you speak them, you can never hear those songs the same way again. This is a dramatized narrative inspired by that world, a file pulled from the cabinet of memory, not a courtroom transcript. Jermaine Jackson, brother of Michael Jackson and one of the core members of the Jackson 5, grew up inside that machine. To the outside world, Motown was a miracle, an assembly line that turned black voices into global stars. To Jermaine, it was also a place where ambition, fear, and quiet compromises left marks no one could see under the stage lights. Over the years, he kept a mental list, not of villains in the simple sense, but of 10 names who, in his eyes, carried the darkest shadows of that empire. Some were mentors, some were idols, some were family. They smiled in photographs, shook hands on award shows, and posed as one big Motown family. Yet behind the cameras they were linked to betrayals, broken friendships, sudden falls from grace, and choices that made Jermaine wonder what a soul was really worth in that world. For him, the first real fracture had a date and a room number. The 29th of July, 1967. Studio A, Hitsville, U.S.A., Detroit. The room where so many records had once made the world believe that black artists could reach any dream if they just sang hard enough. That night, Jermaine was only 13, a boy brought along by his father because the Jackson 5 were being groomed, tested, weighed by the label. The building that usually buzzed with chatter and music felt different. The air, he would later recall, seemed unnaturally still, studio doors half closed, conversations cut short when he walked by, the kind of silence that follows right after something irreversible has happened. As he stepped into the hallway, he saw Florence Ballard, one of the founding members of the Supremes, moving toward the exit. Her eyes were swollen, her coat sliding off one shoulder, her walk unsteady. No one was shouting, no one was comforting her. She just kept going, like someone who had already heard the verdict and knew there was nothing left to appeal. Inside, on Berry Gordy's desk, lay a freshly prepared contract. The letters were clean, almost proud. Diana Ross and the Supremes. On the wall nearby hung a familiar image, a poster of 3 women who had once shared the same dream. Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Diana Ross, smiling in perfect harmony. The details of what happened that day have been told in many different ways. Some people later claimed that it was just business, that every group needs one clear star. Others whispered that the process was far more brutal than any press release would admit. What Jermaine never forgot was the feeling, the sense that a line had been crossed, that the group that had symbolized unity among black women was being reshaped into a vehicle for one person's face. By the end of that night, Florence Ballard was out. Diana Ross, already the center of public attention, began to move into a position where she would soon be the uncontested face of the label. The posters, the billing, the camera angles, everything tilted subtly in one direction. Those who didn't fit that new axis found themselves pushed to the side, gently at first, then more forcefully. Years later, after Jermaine married Hazel Gordy, Berry Gordy's daughter, he would attend elegant Beverly Hills parties where the old Detroit nights felt like a different lifetime. The music was smoother, the clothes more expensive, but the power structure felt the same. Behind the champagne glasses and polite laughter, decisions about careers and futures were still being made in private corners, not public meetings. According to some accounts, people close to that inner circle remembered casual remarks that sounded harmless on the surface but left a chill when you thought about them later. Statements that implied the label, the artists, even the mythology of Motown itself could be shaped, edited, or erased according to who sat closest to the center of power. For a young man like Jermaine, freshly tied to the family through marriage, it was a glimpse behind the curtain he had once idolized from a distance. In his eyes, Florence Ballard's story became the symbol of that first crack. A woman who had helped build one of Motown's most iconic groups was gradually written out of the narrative. The Supremes, once 3 voices standing together, slowly turned into something else. A brand with one dominant figure and 2 silhouettes beside her. Florence's later years were marked by struggle, financial trouble, personal battles, the quiet erosion of someone who had once heard crowds scream her name. When news came in 1976 that she had died in Detroit after years of hardship, Jermaine said he felt a cold weight in his chest. To the world, headlines briefly mourned a former Supreme. Then the machine moved on. To him, it felt like listening to a voice being buried under the very songs it had helped create. Publicly, Diana Ross remained the queen of Motown, a symbol of glamour, success, and breakthrough for black women in music. Jermaine never denied her talent or her impact, but in his private reflections, he saw that era as proof that power in the entertainment industry rarely comes without a hidden invoice. Sometimes it doesn't require shouting or obvious cruelty. Sometimes it just requires signing a paper, accepting a promotion, or allowing someone else's name to fade quietly into the background. That night in 1967, he later said, was when he first understood that Motown's story was not only about harmony and hope, it was also about who got to stay in the spotlight and who was allowed to disappear into the shadows. The dream the world adored was real, but so was the cost, and not everyone survived paying it. And for Jermaine Jackson, Florence Ballard's silent exit from Hitsville wasn't just one singer leaving a group. It was the moment when he realized that the label he had once seen as a family could also behave like a courtroom where verdicts were passed without a jury, and where the record of what truly happened was always subject to revision. If Diana Ross, in Jermaine Jackson's eyes, represented power operating in plain sight, then Smokey Robinson was the shadow moving quietly just behind it. Jermaine didn't describe him as a monster, but as something more unsettling, a man who seemed to know everyone's secrets and rarely showed his own. Inside Motown, some people even referred to him as Berry Gordy's listener, the one who heard everything and forgot nothing. In the fall of 1969, at Hitsville's Detroit headquarters, a strange tension settled over the building. According to people who were there, release dates for new work by Marvin Gaye and the Temptations were suddenly pushed back with no clear explanation. Rumors drifted through hallways, half-sentences in break rooms, glances traded in the studio. No one dared ask outright why, but everyone felt something had shifted. Then Berry Gordy called a private meeting. Behind closed doors, with only selected staff and artists present, a stack of sensitive material was reportedly brought out: personal complaints, fragments of private recordings, even lines from letters that had never been meant for public eyes. As those words were read aloud, people in the room looked around, shaken by how thoughts shared in confidence had somehow found their way to the center of power. Afterward, Jermaine remembered hearing a young employee whisper in the corridor, "Smokey knows everything. He's got the keys to the archives." Whether that sentence was completely fair or just born from fear, it captured how many saw him. Berry Gordy's closest friend, a trusted creative force, and someone with access to information others didn't even know had been collected. Smokey Robinson appeared to the world as the gentle poet of Motown's soft voice, kind eyes, songs about tenderness and longing. Yet Jermaine felt that behind that calm surface, another layer existed. According to stories that circulated among staff, when an artist started talking about leaving the label or challenging decisions, Smokey would be invited to have a talk. What was actually said in those conversations remained between closed doors. But more than a few careers, Jermaine noted, seemed to lose momentum shortly after such meetings. Projects faded, contracts weren't renewed, names slipped quietly off the release schedule. Whispers grew into a kind of legend. Some people claimed Smokey had once handed Gordy a list of artists considered troublesome names like Marvin Gaye or Florence Ballard in exchange for more power inside the company. A Motown engineer later said he had seen Smokey late one night carrying a stack of files out of a secretary's office, loading them into the trunk of a silver car. The next day, according to that account, 2 singers were abruptly removed from upcoming releases. None of this was proven in any courtroom, but in Jermaine's memory, the timing felt too sharp to ignore. By the 1990 seconds, Smokey had left Motown and publicly embraced a life of faith, even becoming a minister. In interviews, he admitted that he had once lived surrounded by lies and betrayal, though he never specified whose lies or whose betrayal. Jermaine interpreted those words as the confession of a man who had heard the quiet suffering of many souls but had chosen not to intervene when their careers were being reshaped, delayed, or erased. Smokey Robinson's story, to Jermaine, was not about a dramatic fall from drugs or scandalous headlines. It was about the slow corrosion of silence, the comfort of standing in a place between light and darkness, close enough to both to benefit from each. On stage, Smokey's smile and love songs lulled audiences into believing in romance and hope. Behind the scenes, an entire generation of artists who never got their full chance at history became, in Jermaine's words, the missing tracks in Motown's archived names that once echoed through the halls, now heard only as faint ghosts behind the hits the world still plays. Jermaine Jackson once said, "There are people whom God seems to touch and then pull his hand away halfway." In his mind, no one at Motown embodied that more painfully than Marvin Gaye. To the world, Marvin was the soulful prophet, the man who could turn pain into melody and social struggle into prayer. But to Jermaine, Marvin's life also showed how a person standing at the altar of faith could slowly slide into something closer to self-destruction. In the summer of 1973, inside a wooden cabin in Topanga Canyon, California, Marvin was working on what would become Let's Get It On. People who were there later recalled a studio drenched in incense, candlelight, and a haze of marijuana smoke. Marvin himself reportedly called the song a kind of prayer of the flesh, a confession set to a slow, hypnotic groove. Outside the booth, a teenage Janice Hunter, just 17 at the time, watched him through the glass. She was the daughter of a black and Mexican model, and witnesses said that the way Marvin looked at her carried both warmth and danger, like someone balancing between protection and temptation. Their relationship took root in that charged atmosphere, somewhere between the console lights and the smoke curling toward the ceiling. Years later, Jermaine said he had seen fragments of Marvin's private writings and remembered one line scribbled as if torn from a conscience in conflict: "I pray before every sin." Whether that phrase was meant literally or metaphorically, it captured the tension that defined Marvin's life, the collision between his religious upbringing and his obsessive search for pleasure and escape. By the time they married in 1977, Marvin was already, according to those close to him, sinking under the weight of addiction, paranoia, and inner turmoil. Friends and family described a man who could be on his knees in deep prayer one moment, then shouting, throwing objects, and accusing the people he loved the next. Janice later spoke of how certain songs the world embraced as healing anthems felt, inside their home, like weapons. When Marvin suspected betrayal, he would blast his own music at full volume, turning the soundtrack of redemption into something that felt more like a warning. Jermaine recalled seeing Marvin once at Motown's Hollywood studio, emerging from a closed session in disarray shirt, rumpled, eyes reddened, muttering fragments of prayers under his breath. In his hand, Jermaine said, Marvin clutched a Bible dusted with a faint white residue. According to Jermaine, Marvin whispered something about having spoken with God, insisting that the message he had received was to keep singing. In that moment, Jermaine no longer saw the clear-eyed hero of soul he had admired as a boy. He saw a man using the language of faith to navigate a world warped by chemicals, pressure, and unresolved guilt. By the early 1980 seconds, Marvin's life had narrowed into a kind of self-imposed isolation. He grew convinced, people around him said, that unseen forces were watching him: the industry, the government, the devil, sometimes all three twisted together in his imagination. He slept with a gun under his pillow. In reflections, he reportedly saw not just himself, but the demons he thought were stalking him. The man whose voice once pleaded for mercy and understanding on the radio now paced his own living room like a captive, listening for threats that might not have been there. On the 1st of April 1984, the day before his 45th birthday, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., after a violent argument inside the family home. That tragic fact is part of public record. What no court document could capture, though, was what Jermaine felt when he heard the news. He said it left him in a kind of stunned silence, as if watching a priest collapse at the altar he had served his entire life. Later, in a reflective interview, Jermaine summarized it with a grim metaphor. Marvin died trying to baptize himself in desire. To the world, Marvin Gaye remains the voice of love and liberation, the artist who dared to sing about war, injustice, and sensuality, all in the same breath. His records still play at weddings, protests, and quiet lonely nights. But in Jermaine's private ledger, Marvin symbolized something darker, the danger of mixing faith and desire until the lines between them vanish. In that blurred space, prayer can become performance, and performance can become a kind of sacrifice, not of animals or offerings, but of the self. For Jermaine Jackson, Marvin's story was a warning written in melody. When a soul tries to use music to cleanse every conflict, every temptation, every wound, there comes a moment when the songs stop sounding like prayers and start to resemble the sound of a man slowly giving pieces of himself away. The world heard beauty. Jermaine heard a confession that never fully found its absolution. On Jermaine Jackson's private list, there was only one man he referred to as a king. But in his telling, it wasn't a crown of honor. It was a throne built from the weight of dozens of lives whose stories never made the official documentaries. That man was Berry Gordy to America, the visionary founder of Motown, the architect who opened the gates for black music to conquer mainstream radio. To Jermaine, he was also something else. A preacher of shadows. A man who had learned how to capture human souls on tape and sell them back to the world as 3-minute miracles. Jermaine often returned in his mind to one night in particular. February 1973, Beverly Hills, California. The Jackson 5 were still shining, still the beloved boy wonders of Motown, and Berry Gordy was celebrating his birthday at his lavish mansion in the hills. Outside, luxury cars formed a gleaming line along the street. Inside, the rooms pulsed with laughter, glasses clinking, and the effortless glamour that comes when fame gathers under one roof. Diana Ross, Smokey Robinson, Rick James, Marvin Gaye, the stars of the label, moved through the crowd like constellations, wrapped in silk, sequins, and the kind of charisma that makes people step aside without realizing it. They toasted Berry, thanked him for their careers, and spoke of the black dream he had helped build. Cameras flashed, compliments flowed. To a young man like Jermaine, it looked like the very definition of success. Black artists dressed like royalty in a house that overlooked the city they had once been locked out of. But when the music faded and the guests drifted out into the cool night, Jermaine stumbled upon a quieter scene that he never forgot. The party was over. The living room lights had dimmed. Somewhere down the hallway, behind a half-closed door, Berry Gordy sat alone in his office. There were no cameras now, no applause, just a man and a desk. On that desk, Jermaine later recalled, was not a birthday card, but a list. Names of Motown artists lined the page, each followed by neat, cold notations. Debts, number of shows, recording sessions, advances, recoupments. It read less like a celebration and more like an inventory sheet. In that moment, something clicked in Jermaine's mind. He realized that for Berry, music was not just art or even business. It was a system, a factory, a machine that turned voices into assets, human beings into columns of numbers. Motown, he came to believe, operated like an industrial line. Every song recorded, every tour performed, every drop of sweat spilled on stage ultimately flowed back into Gordy's control. Contracts were tight, often long-term. Artists who had poured their lives into the label discovered that the records they made, the hits they created, did not belong to them. They belonged to the company. Those who tried to fight that structure, according to many accounts, paid a price. Mary Wells, the woman whose success helped give Motown its first major breakthrough, later found herself effectively cut off from the label's power once she demanded more control over her work. Florence Ballard's decline ended in poverty, far from the glamour she had once helped project. Marvin Gaye, for years, had to battle just to release music that spoke about war, faith, and the wounds of his generation. In Jermaine's eyes, these weren't random tragedies. They were symptoms of a system where the house always won. Over time, darker rumors began to attach themselves to Berry Gordy's legend. Some former insiders claimed his influence was not just financial, but psychological and intimate. Stories circulated about relationships with several women at the label: Diana Ross, Mary Wells, and younger singers who, according to whispers, felt pressured to intertwine survival with complicity. It was said that sex, fear, and loyalty became tangled currencies in an unwritten economy. One former secretary reportedly told of an incident on the 12th of June 1969 when she was instructed to sign a non-disclosure agreement after witnessing a disturbing scene in the studio, a young singer in tears, her clothes disheveled, surrounded by raised voices and threats tied to her work schedule. No charges were ever filed, and official records remained silent. But for Jermaine, stories like this formed part of the unofficial archive of Motown, the one never pressed to vinyl. Around Detroit, another phrase sometimes surfaced: the Motown Circle. According to those who spoke in hushed tones, it was an inner group that met away from microphones and press releases, supposedly led by Gordy and a small group of confidants. Once a month, it was said, they gathered behind closed doors to make decisions: who would be pushed, who would be shelved, whose career would rise like a rocket, and whose name would slowly vanish from radio playlists. Whether the circle truly existed or was just a myth born from resentment and fear, Jermaine felt its presence in the sudden turns people's lives took without explanation. "Evil doesn't dance on stage," he once wrote. "It signs the checks." Berry Gordy, in this vision, was not a cartoon villain. He was the man in the tailored suit at the top of the staircase, holding contracts instead of weapons. He didn't need to destroy anyone himself. All he had to do was decide where the light would shine and how long it would stay. As the years passed and Motown's golden era faded into nostalgia, Berry Gordy's image began to crack. Publicly, he remained the respected founder, praised at tributes and honored in documentaries. But Jermaine noticed something else. Stories of family conflicts over money, former artists who declined to speak his name on camera, and quiet adjustments in how certain museums presented his legacy. According to some accounts, even portraits and displays once installed with pride at Hitsville-related sites were rearranged, softened, or quietly moved out of the spotlight. To Jermaine, the saddest part was not Berry's wealth or his power, but what he believed had been traded to achieve it. In his mind, Gordy had started as a man who wanted to protect and elevate black music, to give it a home in a hostile industry. Somewhere along the way, Jermaine felt, the mission shifted. The soul of the music, the raw, unpolished humanity that had made Motown so revolutionary, became just another commodity to be packaged, controlled, and, if necessary, sacrificed. When that happens, Jermaine wrote, music stops being a living prayer and becomes something else. It turns into an echo, a faint sigh left behind by those who once believed they were climbing toward heaven, only to find themselves trapped in a contract. The songs still play. The hits still sell. But behind every chorus, he heard the rustle of paperwork and the quiet sound of doors closing behind artists who thought they were walking into a family and discovered too late they had signed away their freedom. If Marvin Gaye was, in Jermaine Jackson's view, a soul torn between God and desire, then David Ruffin was the example he used when he spoke about arrogance turning into madness. To the public, Ruffin was the electrifying frontman whose voice could shake an arena and make the world believe in love and heartbreak all at once. Behind the curtain, Jermaine believed, there was a very different man, someone whose talent convinced him that fame gave him permission to cross lines others wouldn't dare approach. In 1968, Detroit was glowing. The Temptations stood at the top of Motown's male groups, a phenomenon that seemed bulletproof. Each night, thousands of fans screamed David Ruffin's name, tall, sharp-featured, with that unmistakable raspy tone that cut through any mix. But as the applause grew louder, the unity inside the group began to fracture. According to bandmates and staff, Ruffin started demanding that the group be officially renamed David Ruffin and the Temptations. He reportedly insisted on flying separately, preferred his own entrances, and wanted the stage lights to follow him above everyone else. When those demands weren't met, people around him said he snapped. Stories circulated of him throwing microphones, punching walls, and declaring that he would teach the world who the real star was. That same year, Jermaine accompanied his father to a Motown studio session and watched Ruffin arrive 3 hours late. As Jermaine remembered it, Ruffin walked in flanked by 2 women and carrying a suitcase that, according to those present, contained a heavy stash of cocaine. During the session, instead of simply singing his parts, Ruffin repeatedly halted the band mid-performance, adjusting the microphone, criticizing arrangements, and finally shouting something that froze the room. "I am the voice of God. No one teaches me how to sing." For the rest of the Temptations and the label, that outburst marked a point of no return. Not long after, they asked Motown to remove him from the group. But Jermaine believed the real tragedy was unfolding far away from spotlights. Ruffin's relationship with Tammy Terrell, the young singer who recorded beloved duets with Marvin Gaye, had long been whispered about in corridors and dressing rooms. Friends said Tammy sometimes appeared with bruises she wouldn't explain, her smile dimmer than the one fans adored on stage. On the 29th of October 1967, during a Motown review concert in Philadelphia, Tammy collapsed in Marvin Gaye's arms mid-performance. She was later diagnosed with a brain tumor. Marvin reportedly believed that the emotional and physical strain she had endured, including alleged abuse, had contributed to her decline, even if doctors never wrote that in any medical report. When Tammy died in 1970, Marvin's faith in love was shattered. To Jermaine, that loss was one of the first great sins that cracked Motown's soul, a wound that no hit song could cover. In his private reflections, he saw Ruffin not just as a troubled star, but as a man whose choices had left scars on people more fragile than he realized. After being fired from the Temptations, Ruffin plunged deeper into heroin addiction. The stories from that period sounded like scenes from a fever dream. In one often repeated account, during a hallucinatory episode, he blocked a car carrying his former bandmates on the highway, climbed onto the roof, and screamed, "I am the Temptations." The press labeled him a mad star, a cautionary tale of ego gone wrong. Jermaine used a different phrase. He called him a singing ghost, a voice still echoing on records while the man behind it wandered further from himself. On the 1st of June 1991, David Ruffin was found dead in a limousine in Philadelphia from what authorities recorded as a drug overdose. Reports stated that the driver dropped his body at a hospital and drove away. For 3 days, according to news accounts, no one claimed him. Only later did loved ones and fans fully understand what had happened. To Jermaine, that lonely detail felt like a kind of grim poetry, the man who had once demanded godlike recognition, leaving this world as if abandoned by the very audience he had tried to dominate. David Ruffin left behind an immortal voice, still sampled, still replayed, still sending shivers down the spine of anyone who loves soul music. But in Jermaine Jackson's story, he also left a warning. In a place like Motown, beauty poisoned by unchecked fame can twist into something monstrous. The songs remain flawless. The performances are legendary. Yet behind them stands a man whose own life became the cost of believing he was larger than the group, larger than the music, and, in the end, larger than the humanity that might have saved him. There was one name on Jermaine Jackson's list that he described with 2 words: pure evil. Not in the literal sense of a murderer stalking victims, but in the way he believed this man pushed others to slowly kill their own souls just to orbit his world. That name was Rick James, the wild architect of funk, who, in Jermaine's telling, turned music into a kind of ritual and pleasure into something that felt like a spell. By the early 1980 seconds, Rick James was one of the brightest stars under Gordy Records, a Motown-related label. To the public, he was explosive charisma, braids, leather, boots, and songs that screamed freedom, sex, and rebellion. Crowds saw a man who refused to be tamed, a black artist demanding the right to live loud in an industry that had once tried to make his predecessors neat and polite. But stories from inside his circle painted a darker picture, one where the line between liberation and destruction blurred until it nearly disappeared. In the summer of 1983, at Rick James's Hollywood Hills mansion, that line would be tested in a way that would later show up in police files. According to reports, the LAPD received an anonymous call about a party that had gone on for days, with guests allegedly not allowed to leave. When officers finally entered the property, witnesses said they found a scene that looked less like a celebration and more like the aftermath of a storm, a room thick with cocaine smoke, red lights casting everything in a feverish glow, and bodies slumped around the pool, some passed out, some barely responsive. In the center of the living room, Rick reportedly stood half-dressed, gripping a microphone, still singing "Super Freak," as if the show hadn't stopped, even though no one was really listening anymore. The incident would later be described in internal documents and interviews as the Red Room scene, a night where music, drugs, and control collided in a way that felt less like entertainment and more like a ritual gone wrong. But the most chilling chapter came years later. In 1991, Rick James and his then-girlfriend, Tanya Hijazi, were charged with serious crimes involving a young woman who said she had been held against her will for days. According to court testimony, she described being forced to take drugs, tied with electrical cords, and subjected to long, terrifying hours as old Motown records blasted at full volume. The music that had once symbolized hope and romance for millions became, in her story, a soundtrack to fear. When questioned about the events, Rick's reported response was cold and bizarre. He insisted it had not been torture, just as he put it, a funk experience. That phrase, delivered in a detached tone, stayed with Jermaine. To him, it sounded like a man who no longer recognized the humanity of the people around him, only their usefulness as props in his personal theater. In Jermaine's narrative, Rick James stopped being simply a troubled star and became something closer to a symbol, a performer who treated excess as a form of worship. Friends spoke of nights that felt like ceremonies. Candles lined up around rooms, Marvin Gaye's records playing in the background, and cocaine sprinkled on bodies like some twisted version of holy water. Some who attended those gatherings later referred to them, half joking and half serious, as the Black Mass of Funk, a place where the only commandments were pleasure and obedience. Young artists were drawn into his orbit, fascinated by his freedom and seduced by the promise of creative electricity. Among them was Teena Marie, the white singer with a voice steeped in soul whom Rick helped mentor. To fans, their collaboration sounded like revolution, racial lines blurred, genres fused, barriers shattered. But Jermaine believed that behind the music, Rick was pulling people into a gravity well they didn't fully understand, testing how far he could push them to ignore their own boundaries just to remain part of his world. These weren't parties in Jermaine's view, they were experiments in power. How much sleep could people lose before they broke? How many drugs would they take if a star told them it was part of the creative process? How many lines, moral, physical, spiritual, would they cross without realizing they had stepped over them until it was too late? In 1993, after being convicted and sentenced to prison, Rick emerged a different man, physically weaker, older. His once unstoppable energy dimmed, yet when he spoke publicly, there was still a defiant edge. In one interview, he reportedly joked that he had met the devil and discovered that he was the devil. For Jermaine, that comment was not clever, it was chilling. He didn't imagine a literal demon hovering over Rick James's shoulder. He saw a human being who had allowed his worst impulses to consume him until there was almost nothing else left. Rick James died in 2004 his apartment in Burbank, California. According to reports, he was found surrounded by reminders of his past. Posters from his glory days, scattered pill bottles, and old Motown vinyl stacked like relics from another life. There was no stage, no cheering crowd, just the quiet of a room where time had caught up. To the world, he remains the king of funk, a legend whose riffs and hooks still ignite dance floors. His influence on music cannot be denied. But in Jermaine Jackson's dramatic retelling, Rick James stood as proof of something more unsettling. When music stops speaking about love, justice, or even honest desire, and starts centering pure worship of lust and excess, the stage can begin to feel less like a place of freedom and more like a chapel built for the wrong God. In that imagined church, Rick James was not just the headliner. He was the one leading the hymns, teaching others how to bow without ever asking what they were bowing to. If Rick James was, in Jermaine Jackson's story, the demon at the center of the fire, then Teena Marie was the first soul he pulled too close to the flames. Jermaine once divided Motown people into two kinds, those consumed by darkness and those who walked toward it willingly. In his mind, Teena belonged to the second category, not an innocent pushed off a cliff, but a believer who kept stepping forward even as the ground crumbled. She entered his world in 1979, a 23-year-old white singer with a voice steeped in black church and R&B, a petite woman whose sound made people look twice the moment they heard her. Around Motown, Berry Gordy and others reportedly praised her as a perfect cultural experiment, a bridge between audiences. A test of how far soul music could travel when the face on the cover didn't match the voice people expected. But Jermaine always felt that Motown was never just about music. It was also about power, identity, and the dangerous thrill of breaking rules in a system that had once tried to cage black art. When Teena met Rick in Studio B, several people later said it was like watching a magnet snap into place. He talked about sound not as notes, but as energy. He framed sex as a frequency, a kind of cosmic transmitter that could send messages to the universe. In that heady atmosphere of late-night sessions and boundary-pushing ideas, Teena, eager to belong and to create something bigger than herself, seemed to lean in. She believed him, or at least, Jermaine thought. She wanted to believe that surrendering to that energy would unlock a deeper, more transcendent music. In the years that followed, they became one of funk's strangest and most compelling duos. On stage and on record, their chemistry was undeniable fire meeting gasoline, turning songs into charged confessions. But behind those blazing duets, Jermaine said, were nights that looked very different from the posters. At Rick's Leopard House mansion in Hollywood, friends spoke of gatherings that felt less like parties and more like experiments in energy transmission. LSD was reportedly used to open the creative gate. They believed, or claimed to believe, that if they reached the right rhythm, the right intensity, their souls would leave their bodies and keep singing even after the music stopped. One studio assistant later described walking past a half-open door and seeing Teena kneeling in a smoky room, eyes closed, singing in what looked like a trance while Rick moved around her, sprinkling cocaine on the floor and around her shoulders like some warped version of a priest conducting a sacred rite. No cameras, no crowd, just two people trying to turn excess into spirituality. Whether every detail of that memory was precise or not, Jermaine used it as a symbol, a picture of someone offering up pieces of herself in the name of art, love, or both. In 1985, at a Motown-connected party in Los Angeles, Jermaine crossed paths with Teena again. The celebration around them was loud clinking glasses, jokes, industry networking. But she, he recalled, seemed strangely out of sync with the room. Pale, shaking slightly, her eyes unfocused, she spoke about Rick as if he still had a hold on her, even when he wasn't physically present. When someone gently asked why she didn't cut ties completely, she reportedly replied, "It's his pain, not mine." For Jermaine, that sentence was one of the most frightening things he had ever heard. It sounded to him like the voice of someone who had absorbed another person's torment so deeply that she no longer recognized where his suffering ended and her own began. She wasn't just in love, she was, in his view, disappearing inside the story of a man who thrived on chaos. After Rick's highly publicized legal troubles and arrest in 1991, Teena's life shifted into a quieter, more fragile phase. She kept making music. The effort was still there, the talent intact, but people who followed her career noticed that her voice, once fierce and unshakable, sometimes carried a tremor, like a candle trying to stay lit in a drafty room. Tours struggled, contracts came and went. The industry that had once hailed her as a phenomenon seemed less interested in the woman who remained after the storm. When Rick James died in 2004, Teena appeared in black at his funeral. Witnesses said she stood silently for a long time, not performing, not giving statements to cameras, just watching the casket as if replaying every chapter no one else had seen. Then, quietly, she slipped out of the public eye again. The music world kept moving forward. New stars rose, old hits were recycled into nostalgia playlists. Teena, however, retreated into a smaller orbit. In her final years, she lived in a Pasadena apartment, surrounded by vinyl, notebooks, and unfinished sheets of music. Neighbors later said they often heard faint singing. Around 3 in the morning, a hoarse voice repeating the same line from her famous duet with Rick, "Fire and Desire." To them, it sounded like someone caught between rehearsal and haunting, as if she were calling back a ghost or trying to let one go. On the 26th of December 2010, Teena Marie was found dead in her sleep. The exact moment she passed was never clearly known. She slipped away somewhere in the quiet hours, alone. There were no parties, no blazing stage lights, just a room where the records and memories remained. To Jermaine Jackson, Teena was not a villain in Motown's story. She was the cursed muse, a woman who loved so deeply, she turned that love into a kind of slow self-sacrifice. In his notes, he wrote a line that captured how he saw her fate. "Evil doesn't just kill, it also destroys the ones who fall in love with it and cannot bring themselves to walk away." In Jermaine Jackson's version of the Motown story, there were three kinds of people: the betrayers, the betrayed, and the ones who chose silence in order to survive. Mary Wilson, co-founder of the Supremes, belonged to that third most complicated category. In his eyes, the beautiful witness who knew too much, said too little, and carried the weight of that choice for the rest of her life. Jermaine once remarked that Mary knew the truth, but waited until almost everyone involved was gone before she fully spoke. In 1967, when Florence Ballard was pushed out of the Supremes and Diana Ross stepped forward as the undisputed face of the group, Mary was one of the few who stood close enough to see both the beginning and the collapse. She had been there when three young women first signed their dreams over to Motown, and she was there, according to Jermaine, on the day when Florence was quietly eased out while a new contract solidified Diana's central role. He pictured Mary watching it all. Diana signing the papers with Berry Gordy, Florence being escorted out of the studio, the heavy thud of the door closing behind her like a full stop at the end of a chapter no one intended to reread. In that moment, Mary didn't shout. She didn't protest. She simply remained still. Later, Jermaine saw that stillness as its own kind of decision. In public, Mary smiled beside Diana during interviews, laughed on talk shows, and played the part of the loyal friend and surviving Supreme. Motown, for a time, seemed to reward that composure. She received solo moments, tours, and a respected position in the group's history. Jermaine recalled once hearing Berry Gordy make an offhand remark to the effect that Mary was a witness who would never fully open her mouth. Whether those exact words were spoken or not, Jermaine believed they captured how the system viewed her. Someone who had seen everything, but could be trusted not to cause trouble. Silence, however, did not free her. In Jermaine's telling, it became a burden she carried into middle age. In 1986, Mary Wilson published her memoir, Dream Girl, My Life as a Supreme, promoted as a behind-the-scenes look at the group's rise. But when an early manuscript reportedly circulated among insiders, people noticed that certain chapters appeared to be missing sections that were said to include more detailed accounts of private meetings, contract changes, and Florence Ballard's desperate attempts to seek help before her final decline. Mary publicly said that Motown's lawyers had pressured her to cut specific parts. Jermaine suspected something even simpler: fear. Not just fear of legal consequences, but fear of reopening wounds that had never healed, of being seen as the one who broke the spell of the Supremes' carefully curated legend. There was another story Jermaine held on to. In 1993, during a televised Supremes reunion, millions watched as Diana Ross embraced Mary on stage, tears glistening under the lights. The crowd applauded the reunion, seeing it as a moment of closure and redemption. But backstage, away from the cameras, Mary was said to have walked off looking pale and shaken. She reportedly turned to her manager and whispered, "I feel like I just betrayed Florence again." It lived only in the memories of those who heard it. In her later years, Mary settled into the role of elder stateswoman, the dignified Supreme who spoke about love, peace, and the legacy of the group. Yet friends claimed that in private, especially after a drink or two, her composure sometimes cracked. She would cry quietly, repeat Florence's name, and murmur, "I should have spoken sooner," as if rehearsing a confession she never fully delivered to the world. On the 8th of February 2021, Mary Wilson died in a car accident near Las Vegas. In the trunk of her vehicle, authorities reportedly found a notebook containing plans for another memoir. On the cover, there was only a single word: confession. To Jermaine Jackson, that discovery said everything. Mary, he wrote, was never a demon in Motown's story. She was the sinner of silence, the person who didn't harm anyone with her hands, but allowed certain lies to live unchecked by holding her tongue. In Motown, Jermaine believed that was its own kind of sin, not the kind that leaves blood on the floor, but the kind that leaves ghosts in every song, waiting for someone to finally say out loud what really happened when the music stopped. Jermaine Jackson once remarked almost reluctantly that Stevie Wonder was the only man he had ever seen who could sing with God, but sometimes seemed to forget he wasn't God himself. In Jermaine's list, Stevie didn't belong among the obviously cruel or openly abusive. His place was stranger, harder to define. Jermaine saw in him what he called sanctified arrogance, a blind genius who, in reaching for divine light, slid into a kind of spiritual control that cast its own shadow. In the 1,970 Stevie Wonder was Motown's perfect emblem. To the outside world, he was the pure-hearted prodigy, a blind black musician whose voice carried hope, joy, and defiance. His image was almost untouchable, a symbol of faith, freedom, and musical brilliance walking hand in hand. But behind the scenes, according to people Jermaine spoke with, another story unfolded quietly. As Stevie's power at the label grew, so did his belief that he wasn't just an artist, but a kind of messenger for God. Sessions around him began to feel less like recordings and more like ceremonies. Musicians recalled that before certain albums, Stevie insisted that everyone in the room feel the holy energy before touching a single instrument. Those who couldn't or wouldn't align with that expectation, they said, were dismissed. Sound engineers started calling them spiritual sessions. Long nights where talking was discouraged, joking was forbidden, and the only acceptable language was prayer or music. Jermaine said he witnessed one of these moments in May 1982 at Wonderland Studios in Los Angeles. The room was dim, heavy with the low hum of machines, and the quiet breathing of the singers standing in a circle. Stevie sat in the center, hands resting on his keyboard, head tilted upward as if listening to something no one else could hear. He told the room that God was sending the music down and warned that anyone impure would corrupt it. A young singer, nervous and sweating, reportedly whispered that she needed to step out for air. Stevie stopped playing. The atmosphere froze. According to Jermaine, Stevie turned toward where her voice had come from and said calmly, "You've let the devil's energy in." The next day, she was gone from the project. No public explanation, just a name, quietly removed from the credits. For Jermaine, that was the moment he began to see a shift. In his eyes, Stevie was no longer just a man of faith using music as a bridge. He was starting to use faith as a measure of obedience. Talented young artists were welcomed into his orbit, fed, supported, and taught. But some later said that along with opportunity came a sense of spiritual indebtedness. They were told, directly or indirectly, that being close to Stevie meant being chosen, and that walking away from him was not just a career decision, but a betrayal of a divine mission. One musician who worked with Stevie claimed he required everyone to write "God is watching" on every sheet of music. It wasn't a printed stamp or a decorative quote. It was a written reminder, repeated again and again, that every note was under surveillance from above. No one, the musician said, dared refuse. To Jermaine, this was another sign that the man he had once admired for his humility was building an invisible throne out of spiritual fear. "I used to admire him," Jermaine reflected, "until I realized he wasn't just singing for God. He wanted to be sung to." In that line, he captured his deepest worry, that Stevie's conviction he was saving souls had slowly isolated him instead. Friends drifted away as the expectations grew heavier. Colleagues stepped back, tired of walking the fine line between genuine belief and what felt like control dressed up as devotion. In his later interviews, Stevie often spoke about hearing God's voice more clearly than ever. He described feeling guided, protected, chosen, but those close to him, according to Jermaine, noticed something else: a growing mistrust of everyone around him, a reliance almost solely on that inner voice. His blind eyes, they said, seemed more tired, as if the responsibility of always being the conduit between heaven and earth had worn him down. Jermaine called it the arrogance of light, the danger that comes when someone believes they have found truth so purely that they no longer see the darkness quietly creeping in around its edges. To the world, Stevie Wonder remains a kind-hearted genius, an icon whose songs continue to inspire and comfort millions. To Jermaine, within this dramatized narrative, He was the man who saw too much with his spirit, until the very light he trusted most began to consume the parts of his soul he could no longer see. Fun 10. In Jermaine Jackson's list, the final name was the one that unsettled him most. Not because of cruelty in the obvious sense, but because of the beauty of his collapse. Michael Jackson, the little brother he had once tried to shield, did not, in Jermaine's mind, turn into a demon like some of the others. He became something far more haunting. An angel who learned how to live in the dark and almost convinced the world it was light. Born in 1,958 inches, Gary, Indiana, Michael came into a world of cramped rooms, factory shifts, and a father who treated his sons less like children and more like an investment. Joseph Jackson drove his boys hard, drilling them for hours, pushing them onto stages where their smiles were part performance, part armor. When the Jackson Five signed with Motown in 1969, Michael was only 11. Berry Gordy and Diana Ross immediately recognized his potential. To the label, he was a gift, innocent, adorable, and most importantly, moldable. Motown turned him into the savior face of the company, the wide-eyed boy who could charm both black and white audiences, the symbol of a new generation. Behind the cute interviews and polished performances, however, there were long rehearsals that stretched late into the night, television tapings that chewed up his childhood hours, and threats for missed notes or imperfect steps. The official word for it was training. In Jermaine's telling, it felt much closer to conditioning, a kind of elegant brainwashing where applause replaced comfort. Diana Ross, named his mentor and public guide, taught him everything: how to tilt his head into the light, how to smile at the right camera, how to answer questions in a way that seemed humble but never threatened the brand. She took a shy black child and helped sculpt him into a flawless performer. Yet, Jermaine watched with growing unease as their relationship took on strange layers. Between Diana and Michael, he believed there existed a bond that flickered between maternal and possessive, worshipful and territorial. By the time Michael was about 20, the two of them were seen in Beverly Hills, walking hand in hand, their closeness feeding speculation. The press framed it as a divine connection between two musical forces, a fairy tale made for magazines. Jermaine saw something different. To him, it felt like a coronation ritual, the passing of a hidden crown, tying Michael forever to the empire that had shaped and exploited his boyhood. Even after leaving Motown, Michael could never fully escape the shadows of Diana or Berry. He reinvented himself again and again, changing his voice, reshaping his nose and jaw, lightening his skin through a mix of medical conditions and cosmetic decisions. In Jermaine's view, each transformation was more than vanity. It was an attempt to erase the face of the child who had been controlled, corrected, and packaged. Every time Michael looked into a mirror, Jermaine believed, he saw not just himself, but the people who had built him, and he wanted them gone. So he tried to surgically cut them out of his reflection, bleaching away the boy from Gary, flattening the nose that reminded him of his father, crafting a new image that didn't match the one Motown had turned into a product. But with every change, the ghost of that younger Michael only grew louder in the world's memory, chasing the man who no longer recognized himself. In Neverland, the ranch Michael called his sanctuary, former staff later described long, eerie nights. According to some of them, he would play old Motown records on repeat, pacing through his private theater or his bedroom halls, whispering the names of the dead under his breath. Marvin, Florence, Rick, and others whose stories had ended badly. One maid claimed there was a locked cabinet filled with photographs of Diana Ross, Berry Gordy, Marvin Gaye, Rick James, and other figures from his past, each marked with strokes of red ink. When asked why he kept them, she said he only replied, "They're family." He also spoke, according to people close to him, about Motown souls still living through my music, as if the voices of those who had suffered under that system were trapped inside his albums, echoing in harmonies and ad-libs the world never noticed. Engineers recalled late-night sessions where Michael would insist that all the lights be turned off. He'd ask them to play "I'll Be There," the song that had once introduced him as a sweet, angelic child, and then sit motionless in the dark, surrounded by candles. One night, they found him collapsed on the floor, the wax melted into strange shapes around him as if he had tried to hold a vigil for himself. In 1993, the first wave of child abuse allegations broke into the public eye. The world watched, stunned, as the man they had called the King of Pop appeared on screen, looking fragile, defensive, and deeply uneasy. To many he seemed simply bizarre, a recluse, lost in his own fantasy. Jermaine saw something more complicated. A man whose fear had turned into instinct, who no longer understood where the line stood between love and control, innocence and desire. What the world labeled as sin, Jermaine believed Michael, in his most twisted paralysis, experienced as ritual, a desperate attempt to heal his own brokenness by replaying and rewriting the childhood that had been taken from him. None of that excuses anything, and Jermaine never tried to present him as a saint. He saw Michael instead as someone trying to save himself in ways that only dragged him deeper into darkness. When new allegations and investigations resurfaced in the early 2000s, Michael began living like prey. He avoided public places, barricaded himself in rented mansions, and, according to friends, drifted through days half awake, half sedated. Mirrors and pill bottles replaced stage lights and applause.